The topic that I chose for today is, and I'm doing this from up here on the Bema instead of closer to you, just because of the Zoom, and I want to share my screen. And it's just easier to do it from this laptop than that laptop. So just a few logistical things. So because everybody here in the room has the source sheets, thanks to Morris for handing them out to everybody. But if you're on Zoom, don't worry, I'll share my screen and you'll be able to see what everybody else is looking at. The topic that I chose, Jewish perspective on non-binary identity, frankly, I would never have thought to choose 5 years ago. Maybe to be safe, 10 years ago. Because when you grow up in a particular generation and a particular time, the idea that there are more possibilities than just male and female is just, it just doesn't come to mind. You don't think about that. And when I was growing up, frankly, you know, to be fair, it probably wasn't until late in high school that I would even have thought about and heard about people who were homosexual. So, but that could be just me. And I went to a very cloistered Jewish day school in the Philadelphia suburbs. So it's possible that based on the school and my background, that I might not have had more of a knowledge of non-male, non-female, non-heterosexual options. So what, back in May, the Conservative Movement's Law Committee passed a teshuvah, a legal decision, unanimously about calling people up onto the Bema in a non-gender specific way, which is related to non-binary. So it is from that, and we'll get to that on the source sheet, I promise. It is from that that it has prompted me to think more about this and to add to my signature, both on email and on Zoom, the parentheses he, him for the pronouns. There are a lot of people, my wife included, who have put these pronouns and have been doing so for a couple of years already. My wife works as an administrator at the Charles E. Smith Jewish Day School, and for several years already, faculty and staff have been encouraged to include their pronouns in their signature. But again, for me, it's taken a lot to learn about this and to get used to this and to understand that the norms that we grew up with, male, female, are not the norms that everybody necessarily subscribes to today. And so what I want to do, and excuse me here in the sanctuary, but I'm just sharing my screen on Zoom. What I want to do is look at this source sheet and start with source number 3. All right, everybody has it in hand or sees it on Zoom. And there are extra copies on the podium. So what is the gender binary? That's what this source is, from a source called verywellmind.com. I can't vouch for these websites. You can do a little bit more research yourselves. on these websites, but I think for our purposes, they serve our purpose well. So what is the gender binary? The gender binary is the problematic notion that there are only two genders, and all individuals are either a woman or a man. That's the binary either or. Okay, so the gender binary is either or. You're either man or woman. Some might argue that there are only two sexes, so there should only be two genders, but that argument is flawed. Okay, so now, again, based on where you grew up, how you grew up, perhaps you're used to the binary. But I'm telling you, if you go to public school today, there is definitely not a binary. And even if you don't go to public school, if you go to the Charles E. Smith Jewish Day School, you will see that there's not a binary anymore. Lenore tells me a lot about stories that happen at school, and there are kindergartners who look to be a boy or a girl, but who dress the opposite, because they already in kindergarten feel as if they don't want to dress as a boy just because they look at like a boy, or because they don't feel like a boy or they don't feel like a girl, and they want to dress like how they feel. Okay, so that's kindergartners at the Charles E. Smith Jewish Day School. And I'm sure it's like that in Montgomery County public schools as well, and in public schools across the country. Okay, so we'll get to another source that deals with that in a moment, but I just want to lay this out and to have us begin to recognize that what we're used to as the binary, man or woman, is not accurate. So the source goes on. Although we categorize most infants into male or female, there is more diversity than that in terms of sex. The biology of sex is complex. Most are XX or XY based on the chromosome, right? And I think men are XX and women are XY. No? It's the opposite? Okay. So, okay, this isn't a science class. So whatever it is, the XX or the XY, one of them is men, one of them is woman. But some people have chromosomes that are different, that are XXY or XO. So that presents challenges both to the person who has that kind of chromosome. No, not both. It just presents challenges to the person that has that kind of chromosome to, source sheets are on the podium, to understand who they are. Okay, so if you are XX or XY, that might make it easier. I'm looking at source sheets that are on the podium, on this podium right here, if you want to look at. So if you have normal chromosome, then you are either easily hormonally and biologically defined as a particular gender. But if your chromosomes are different, then that makes you non-binary. Just chromosomally, biologically, you are non-binary. Now, if you are XX or XY, sexuality isn't dependent upon XX or XY. Sexuality is different. So in other words, whether we are heterosexual or homosexual or bisexual is not based on XX or XY. That is based on other factors. Okay? So simply put, about gender, not about sexuality, but about gender, there's already an understanding that not everybody is simply XX or XY. Okay? Now, on the next page, on the second page, in addition, your chromosomes don't fully determine your sexual anatomy. Some people have XY chromosomes and are born with uteruses. Okay, so that's why XY is a boy. Okay, so men are not born with uteruses, but sometimes it happens that people who are XY might be born with a uterus. The term for people who have a mix of hormonal and anatomical traits typically associated with male or female bodies is intersex. Someone can be intersex, but a person is not an intersex. Cultures around the world have recognized genders other than woman and man throughout history. Sorry for that number 8 there. It's just that we are now developing an English language vocabulary to describe the spectrum of gender identities that exist, including the terms non-binary and NB. NB, the word ENBY, stands for the letters NB, meaning non-binary. Okay, right? So you can choose to be called non-binary or NB. So the last paragraph, and then I want to get to Jewishly what they're talking about. Cultures around the world have recognized genders other than woman and man throughout history. We'll see source number 2 that proves that, but we'll get there in a moment. So let's just finish this source. To be a non-binary person is essentially exactly what it sounds like: to identify yourself and your gender as existing outside of the binary definitions of man or woman, masculine or feminine. I often, the author here, hear from the non-binary people I know that a definitive gender identity is something that doesn't make sense to or for them. Identifying as genderqueer myself, I relate to the inability to force myself to exist comfortably within the social rules surrounding gender. That's why the word non-binary is so beautiful, because many identities and expressions can exist within its definition. So, which leads me to be thinking that non-binary isn't just a biological definition that one might have for oneself. It can be, but it's not restricted to a biological definition. That there could be people who choose that they like the idea of not being defined or put in a box. There are a lot of people who prefer to be outside the box in a variety of ways. And non-binary can be one of those ways that a person can choose to be outside the box. But there's also a biological, physical component to it. Okay, so it's not just people are choosing to be this way artistically or whatever motivation they might have to do so. There is biological, hormonal, chromosomal reasons for people to be this way too. Yes, Gabe.
Every year we go to this issue with students, the vocabulary for the curriculum.
Yeah.
And the vocabulary changes so rapidly.
Yes.
But I've heard it from a number of transgender students and colleagues that they don't like non-binary because it frames their gender in the negative.
Uh-huh. Okay, so Gabe is saying that he has had experience with people who are transgender and who say that they prefer not to use the term non-binary because it sounds negative. So what do they choose? What do they use instead?
I've heard sense of
Okay, so there are a number of other ways to do that, and I'm not going to get into the sociology of all this. This is a serious discussion, and I'm not up on all of the information required to have a serious discussion sociologically about this. What is American society like? I wanted to narrow this to just have an introduction to what a definition of non-binary is, and to understand this within a Jewish context. So the source number 3 mentions cultures around the world have recognized genders other than woman and man throughout history. So I want to now go to source number 2. Source number 2 is from reformedjudaism.org, but it's one of many sources I could have found to highlight this. So in the Mishnah, the Mishnah is the first collection of Jewish law edited 1800 years ago, right? So in the history of Jewish law and practice, there's the Torah and the rest of the books of the Bible. Rest of the books of the Bible finished around 500, 400 BCE, okay? Then from about 100 BCE to 200 CE, a group of people, the sages, were studying the Torah and the Bible, creating what we know as Judaism today, independent of the temple in Jerusalem, okay? So those sages were interpreting the Torah and the Bible to develop the system of Jewish law that we have. And the first edited version of their teachings is known as the Mishnah. 6 volumes, and covering any and all topics that you can imagine, and including gender, okay? And so gender comes up in the Mishnah as a matter of Jewish law, especially when it comes to marriage, right? You have to know who you're marrying. And the question here, or what source number 2 is pointing out to us, is that the rabbis physically knew people who do not conform to the typical male-female binary based on anatomy. So in the Mishnah, there are a number of different genders and sexes that are discussed. In addition to Zahar, male, and Nekeva, female, there are 4 other genders or sexes that the rabbis recognize. And this isn't, like I said, in just one place in the Mishnah or the Talmud. It appears many places throughout. So, and androgynos, note the Greek or Latin term, is a person who has both male and female sexual characteristics. So there were people born that way physically with both female and male anatomy. That's an androgynos. So the question arises, is this person a man and can marry a woman? Or is this a woman and can marry a man, right? So it depends. A tumtum is a person whose sexual characteristics are indeterminate or obscure. Okay, so androgynos has both male and female. A tumtum has neither. And then there are gradations. An Ilonite is a person who is identified as female at birth, but develops male characteristics at puberty and is infertile. So an Ilonite is a person who seems to have been born female with female anatomy, but then somehow around puberty or later develops male characteristics, and that makes them infertile. So that's also a question as to whether an Ilonite as a woman can marry a man. And if so, what would be grounds for divorce if it's understood that this Ilonite is infertile? Right, so there could be an Ilonite who doesn't develop the male characteristics, but is also just happens, because you don't know, the rabbis didn't have chemical ways of testing chromosomes. They only knew what people looked like. So a person who looks like a woman anatomically is assumed to be a woman. The question then is, they could end up being an Ilonite, that person, because they are infertile. Or perhaps there's the beginning of male anatomy developing. Okay, and then a Saris is a person who is identified as male at birth, but develops female characteristics at puberty and or is lacking male genitalia. Okay, so the rabbis knew that, I'll say this, the rabbis knew that most people in their society were binary, were either male or female. But there were enough of these characteristics around to warrant the rabbis to talk about them and discuss them and keep for posterity in rabbinic literature these concepts. Just one second, please. I'm just doing live transcript. Okay, so, okay. Right, so again, there have to be enough people in society to warrant the rabbis to talk about it, and to talk about it enough that it was recorded in the Mishnah and then later in the Talmud. Okay, so it's enough then to say that it's that non-binary existed in the time of the Mishnah 1800 years ago, which is fascinating. It is fascinating. Okay, now, so so that's sources 3 and 2. Okay, another Jewish source is source number 1, which I remember learning a number of years ago, but it's applicable to this discussion too. So in the creation, yes, Iris.
Did this concept originally come from the Torah?
Did this concept originally come from the Torah? No. The Torah does not know. I'll say it in the positive. The Torah only knows about binary. So in all the discussions in the Torah about sexual relations, for example, which we're going to read momentarily at Mincha, from chapter 18 of Leviticus, for example, it knows of men and it knows of women, physically as men or women. It knows that men cannot wear women's clothes and women cannot wear men's clothes. That's listed in either Exodus or Deuteronomy. That as one of these in the what's known as the, or maybe it's in Leviticus, I don't remember offhand, one of these holiness codes about proper ethical moral conduct. Okay, so men have to wear men's clothing, women have to wear women's clothing. That's just based on the Torah. It's not today, obviously. So in other words, Iris, you're wearing pants. There's nothing wrong with that today because pants that women wear are fashioned differently than pants that men wear. And that's enough for most traditional Jews to say it's okay for a woman to wear pants. Okay, but that's a whole other discussion about the Orthodox world and how they understand dress code. So the Torah knows simply that there are men who are physically men, anatomically men, and women who are anatomically women. It does these categories in source number 2 are not from the Torah. They're from the rabbis, seeing what society is around them. But source number 1 is from the rabbis based on a verse in the Torah that calls into question that maybe non-binary is alluded to in the Torah itself. So in chapter 1 of Genesis, where we read about how God created the world in 6 days. And on the 7th day, God rested. On the 6th day, just getting out my Chumash, and I just want to read it. But aside from the verse that's here in the source, I just want to read it from the original. Okay, so, right. So it starts with verse 24 of chapter 1. God said, let the earth bring forth every kind of living creature, cattle, creeping things, and wild beasts of every kind, and it was so. God made wild beasts of every kind and cattle of every kind and all kinds of creeping things of the earth, and God saw that this was good. And God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. They shall rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the cattle, the whole earth, and all the creeping things that creep on earth. And God created man in his image. Sorry for the gender here. God created man in God's image. In the image of God, God created him. Male and female, God created them. Okay? So the verse, it's verse 27. Verse 27, God created man in God's image. In the image of God, God created him. Male and female, God created them. So the number changes in the verse from singular to plural. So we might not pick it up right away, but it's important for this source number 1. Right, so God created man on the 6th day, and man, we shouldn't understand it in a gender neutral way. We understand it as Adam in the Hebrew, so it is gender specific. God created a man, a gender specific man, but then masculine and feminine, he created them. So what does that mean? Is it one person that God created on the 6th day, or is it 2 people that God created on the 6th day? Okay, so there's a question in the verse itself. So that leads to this midrash, which is source number 1. God said, let us make Adam, man, in our image, in our shape. That was verse 26. Rabbi Yirmiyah ben Elazar said, when the Eternal created Adam initially, he was created as both genders. Thus it is written, male and female did God create them. So the original person, according to Rabbi Yirmiyah ben Elazar, was both male and female, non-binary. According to this source, Rabbi Yirmiyah says that God created the first human being as non-binary. Okay, and the source goes on. Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachman said, when the Eternal created Adam initially, God created him with two faces, one on each side. So that's another way to understand male and female, God created them. Two faces, kind of like a Siamese twin. Okay, so picture that as a Siamese twin, but with one body. Okay, so one body, but two heads. Okay, so that's what Shmuel says to understand that verse as male and female, God created them. Okay, so either non-binary according to Rabbi Yirmiyah, or a body with two heads according to Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachman. And when God made Eve, Chava, God split him along the middle, forming two backs. So a kind of a crude surgery that took place by God, placing this, right in chapter 2, God tells Adam to go to sleep and takes the rib out of Adam to create Eve, right? So according to Shmuel Bar Nachman, that means God took a hatchet and cut Adam down the middle, right? Picture the two heads on the one body, and between the two heads, God took a hatchet and cut the whole body. Okay, God can do this. Okay, not if we did this, that, right? So you have to play with this, understanding what the story says in chapter 1 and 2. So it's not less barbaric or gross than to read in chapter 2 in the Torah that God put Adam to sleep and took a rib out of his body and created Eve that way. So what's more gross? Pulling a rib out of somebody's body or taking a hatchet and splitting them down the middle? Taking a hatchet is more gross. You say, okay. So God split them along the middle, forming two backs. They challenged him. So the rabbis challenged Rabbi Shmuel, but it is written, God took one of his ribs. How can you say he split him down the side? He said to them, meet salo, now it's not salo sav, salo tav. Paul would pronounce it salo sav, but I pronounce it salo tav. It's the letter tough without the dot in it. Meet salo tav doesn't mean rib. It means one of his sides, similar to that which is said, and to the tzelah, the side of the tent, which is translated the side of the tent. Okay, so all the details here to give a source that is from the time of the rabbis, the same time where they're dealing with androgynos, tumtum, ilonit, and saris. So the same rabbis who know about those categories and defined those categories are also writing these creative stories about the creation of the first human beings. And they are suggesting, Yirmiyah and Shmuel are suggesting that the first human being was non-binary. Okay, so I think that's pretty dramatic, right? So we go from source 3, 2, and 1 to understand what non-binary is, to understand that we have non-binary categories within Jewish law, and we have it even based on the Torah itself from the very first chapter of the Torah in the book of Genesis and the creation of the first human being, perhaps being a non-binary human being. So I want to look at source number 4 and get back to the question that some of us may have who are not so keen on non-binary language and maybe not so open-minded about it, who trying to figure out where this could have come from. Okay, so just that question alone is perhaps not an appropriate question to ask in this conversation about non-binary. In other words, the more appropriate thing is to be open and accepting and non-judgmental of people and how they want to identify. But because we are human beings, and especially on Yom Kippur, we understand our flaws as human beings, most of us are judgmental of others. Okay, and so we are judgmental as Jews. We are judgmental of other people who are not Jews. As white people, we are judgmental of people who are not white, etc., etc. If we're Democrat, we're judgmental of people who are Republican, and vice versa. You get what I'm saying. Okay, so by nature, we are judgmental because we know who we are, and we, by nature, judge other people based on who we are or who we are not. It's just the nature of human beings. Okay, so if we are parents and a child exhibits non-binary characteristics, or let's say you're the parent of that kindergartner at the Jewish day school, and the kindergartner who you think as a parent is a boy wants to dress as a girl, what do? And you might think your initial reaction as a parent is, uh-oh, this is presenting challenges to me that I did not plan on, right? So you think that your child is a boy or is a girl, and now they're behaving and acting differently. This makes life more challenging as a parent. And so that leads to source number 4, which the day school, the Charles E. Smith Day School, sent out to parents to help parents begin to understand non-binary issues. So I thank Lenore for sharing this with me. So in this article in Psychology Today, Devin Fry reports on the questions often asked by parents whose children say they are transgender, non-binary, or gender fluid. So those could be the other categories that Gabe might have been referring to before, that if people don't want to use the negative word non-binary, they can use transgender or gender fluid. Here are the answers suggested by the pediatricians, endocrinologists, psychiatrists, psychologists, researchers, and clinicians interviewed by Psychology Today, right? Did we cause this? Right? Parents could ask that question of their child. No, they wouldn't ask the child. They would ask each other. The parents could ask each other, what did we do to cause this? The question comes up frequently because having a gender non-conforming child often feels like an aberration. We cannot minimize the lifetime of conditioning against this, says New York psychotherapist Ken Page. In many families, a lot of energy goes into seeking explanations. Was it overindulgence, previously unknown abuse, a same-gender role model? When parents go down this rabbit hole, says Fry, it can cause great distress to children who desperately seek parental validation and are skilled at recognizing when they're not getting it. Right? So the conversation, if parents are having this conversation, where did I go wrong? Children pick up on the fact that parents are having this conversation, and children could think that they did something wrong to cause this, as opposed to children thinking this is who you are. So now let's go from there, right? As opposed, right? So you get what I'm saying. If parents are saying, where did I go wrong? That means something's wrong with the child. And if they keep on having conversations, where did I go wrong? They keep projecting to the child that they've done something wrong as a child. Okay? So as opposed to saying, this is who our child is, and the child is validated because this is who the child is, and they are just proceeding as due course. Okay? The expert consensus is that parents are not responsible for the changes their child is going through. Gender identity is not something a parent can cause to be different or to change, says Daniel Schumer, a pediatric endocrinologist in Michigan. Melissa Sipersky, a psychologist at Vanderbilt University, agrees. This is who your child is as a person. It's not something that happened to them. Okay? So that's with the understanding that people who are choosing to be non-binary, that they're not choosing, that they are reflecting somehow the hormonal chromosomal makeup of their body that is somehow prompting them to say, I feel like I am non-binary, that this seems right to me to be non-binary. So none of us, I don't think there's an endocrinologist in this room. And even if there is, you can't, as an endocrinologist, you can't tell something by, well, that I shouldn't say that. You can't tell this non-binary based on just by looking at them to know what their hormones are inside. You have to do blood tests on that to understand what the chromosomal, the DNA is, et cetera, right? There's certain things you can look at somebody and say that something chemically is wrong with them. Right? Babies who are jaundiced, let's say, right? They have a yellow complexion. So there's nothing about being non-binary that exhibits physically like that outwardly to anybody. So what this is suggesting is that people who are choosing to be non-binary are not really choosing it. There's something they feel that the chromosomes, the hormones are prompting them to be this way, possibly. So now the next point, okay, so what does cause it? Gender diversity has always existed, said Fry. It shows up across cultures and is not unique to today's youth. That's what the other sources pointed out too. There's likely a genetic component and hormonal exposure in utero may be involved, but those factors have existed through human history. So why do there seem to be so many transgender young people today? A recent report estimated there are 300,000 in the US, twice as many as previously reported, right? It seems like this is a conversation that is gaining more traction today than it did 5 years ago. Well, the next paragraph, one reason may be changes in data gathering. It wasn't until 2017 that the CDC surveys began asking teens about their gender identity. There have also been changes in cultural perspectives. The understanding that gender is on a spectrum, says Melina Wald at Columbia University, that one's gender and sex assigned at birth may not correspond, and that one doesn't need to fit into a particular stereotype, is a much more dominant view now. This has caused a lot of people to pause and think more critically about who they are, not who they were told they are, or who they think they should be. Okay, so I think this also leads into, right, non-binary being a reflection of something chemical, anatomical, physical, biological with the body, to a pure choice that people are making today. Right, so there's discussion about people choosing their sexuality, right? So I still believe that it's 80 or it's at least 80% of people are born heterosexual. So you can be born homosexual, and then there are people who choose to not to be defined by a particular sexuality or sexual behavior preference. They choose to be bisexual or, right, either or. And possibly with people who are choosing not to be identify as non-binary could be a reflection of that too. In other words, the more open the society is and aware of differences in people, the more the more common it will become for people to choose to not be defined by particular societal norms. Right? So it's may not be so cool anymore to say, yeah, what they call cisgender. Right? I was born a man and I identify as a man. That may not be seen as progressive or whatnot, and people might choose to be more progressive in how they identify to other people and how they identify themselves, and that it could be seen as a good thing not to be boxed in to particular norms and identity. So that leads us to source number 7, right? Because we just don't have the time to go over the other sources too, but source number 7 is from the Teshuvah, the rabbinic decision of the law committee of the conservative movement. So these 3 rabbis co-wrote this decision, which like I said, was accepted unanimously. There was one abstention, but all rabbis on the law committee, which I think the rabbis trend from more traditional to less traditional, all accepted this teshuvah, that there should be language, don't have a chance to really read through it, but Hebrew language, and how we call people up to the bima specifically should reflect people's identity, right? And in the time we have left, Hebrew is a gender-based language, and when I say you to Cantor Adina, if I was saying you in Hebrew, I'd have to say at. But to Morris, I would say ata. Okay, so that's just so I'm already defining Adina as a woman and Morris as a man based on the language, the Hebrew language. That's just the nature of Hebrew language. And so that makes it challenging for the issue of non-binary in Israel and in the Jewish community and in synagogue practice. So our religious committee accepted the recommendation of source 7 of the Teshuvah to try to be more gender neutral in calling people up. Instead of saying ya'amod or ta'amod, we now say na la'amod, please come forward, please rise, which is a gender neutral way of saying it, instead of saying ta'amod, which is you woman, come forward, or ya'amod, you man, come forward. Okay, and so that's, I guess I could go on, but we don't have time to go on. Any questions or comments? Bill. The teshuvah on homosexuality was in 2006. Yes. So I don't remember exactly. I will say yes, Bill. It had the requisite amount of votes to allow it to be an accepted position within the conservative movement. That is that people who are homosexual in their behavior are allowed to be rabbis and cantors. Rabbis can officiate at gay and lesbian weddings, etc. So I think that this is different, though. The issue of homosexuality is different than the issue of non-binary or gender fluidity. The difference is that the Torah specifically says a man shall not lie with a man in the manner of lying with a woman. It is an abomination. So homosexual behavior is prohibited from the Torah. So that has made it more difficult over the ages to reinterpret that. Whereas non-binary has existed And how you call someone up onto the bima is less halachic and has less of a Torah imprint than does homosexuality. Okay, so that's why I think the teshuvah about calling someone up onto the bima was easily passed. It's a way to be inclusive that everybody can agree on. And why do we want to judge people in synagogue? Of all places, synagogue is supposed to be a sanctuary, literally a place to seek refuge. Why are we judging people? Why do we continue to judge people in synagogue? Let's be gender fluid. Let's recognize that and how we call people up onto the bima. So it's a no-brainer, apparently, because it passed unanimous. Yes, Iris, and then we'll stop.
So does Judaism accept sexual differences in people, but they do not accept sexual behavior in people?
Right. So Iris is asking, does Judaism accept sexual difference in people, but not sexual behavior in people? The short answer is yes. But now that's the short answer. The traditional short answer is yes, you're right. Sexual behavior is different than gender identity.
Can you have one without the other?
How can you have one without the other? It's nuanced, but because of those categories, Iris, androgynous, tumtum, ilonite, and saris, who's to say that any of those people are not by nature heterosexual? Just because they have different or no or both physical anatomical features doesn't mean that they're not heterosexual. So you can be heterosexual and theoretically be androgynous. But then how do you put that into practice?
Right.
So these are difficult questions, Iris. They're complex questions, and we're not going to solve them here, but it's part of the conversation about this. And that it's not so easy to put people into a box and say, this is who you are, and this is how you have to behave. It's nuanced, and we can't tell people that. And even if people need to decide for themselves how they want to identify and how they want to behave. And that I think is the bottom line here that our conservative movement would be teaching. Okay, so it's 4:53, and I think that we're going to start with Mincha now. So that will mean that Michael Gross, are you here? Here. I know Michael Gross is in the building. He was sitting outside, so he's our Torah reader. Howie is our davener. Paul has Haftarah. Kohen. Here, we have a Kohen. Either one of you could be Kohen, maybe both of you. Okay. Do we have a Levi here? Yeah.